It's MeerWissen Monday with your hosts Paul Tudor and Hauke Kegler again. That also means we are ready with another episode of Ocean Insight. Today is all about how to set managing priorities at the interface of land and sea, and what role cultural aspects may play in this. Joining us today from the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa are Linda Harris and Myriam Perschke. Linda is an expert in sandy beach systems and coastal conservation management, while Myriam is currently conducting her PhD on mainstreaming ecosystem services into coastal planning. Tuning in from the Helmholtz-Centre Hereon in Geesthacht is Gee. She's looking into the role of cultural ecosystem services in coastal and marine planning. So let's dive right in. Linda, could you tell us, maybe in layperson's terms, what CoastWise is doing?
Sure, thanks very much. So in South Africa, what we do is we have a very good focus on biodiversity assessment and spatial prioritization. So what that means is that we look at how biodiversity is doing in the country, and we have a few headline indicators that we use. These are things like ecosystem threat status. So people will have heard of things like the critically endangered ecosystem and so on. So we assess all of the ecosystem types based on their threat status. And we also look at their protection level, so how well they are represented in protected areas. And then the spatial prioritization that we do is we look at the most efficient and best ways to represent biodiversity in protected areas and in other areas that are not necessarily protected areas, but that also confer some sort of safeguarding of the biodiversity that's within that. And in the past, in South Africa, the way that we've done this is very much on a realm basis. And by that, I mean that the terrestrial components has been done separately from the inland aquatic, so the rivers and wetlands, separately from the estuaries and separately from marine. And the result is that the coast, which actually spans more or less all of those, has not come through very strongly. And often ecosystem types and ecotones such as sandy beaches and dunes are separated into their different components and are not well represented. So what the CoastWise project is aiming to do is to address some of that and to look at the first assessment of South Africa's coast as a particular zone. We'll be looking at in terms of the biodiversity assessment, and then also ways to improve this in the future and to do spatial prioritization. So identifying those areas that are priorities for estuaries and for the coast, and really just to start making progress in terms of taking that work forward. Also generating new spatial data, because we've recognized some gaps that we need, and generating new data to fill those gaps. So more or less in a nutshell, that's the overall aim of what CoastWise is trying to do, is really just to contribute to spatial assessment and prioritization of South Africa's coastal biodiversity.
Excellent, thanks. I guess it's not a new effort that you started with CoastWise. How was the idea conceived? I've seen that there's quite a few partners. Maybe you can tell a bit about them. As far as I understood, there's not only research institutions involved.
Yes, thanks. It's the organizations that are represented, at least the South African partners, have been working together for a long time. And that's the really great thing about the National Biodiversity Assessment itself, is that it brings together more or less all of the organizations that are working in biodiversity in the country. And that, like you say, that spans the government organizations, it spans research institutions. So there are many, many different entities that are represented in that spatial biodiversity assessment. And so, yeah, like I said, we've been working together for a long time, and it came out of the National Biodiversity Assessment 2018. So South Africa does this assessment every about 5 to 7 years. And the one that was done in 2018 was the third one. And this is where, for the first time, a separate coast report was written. And that, like I said, those headline indicators of ecosystem threat status and ecosystem protection level were calculated for all of the coastal ecosystem types. And It was basically in this process that we realized just how much we needed to advance this work. Also, for quite a long time, even in my PhD, we started doing spatial prioritization for coastal systems. In my PhD, I focused on sandy beaches. So this kind of thinking has been around for a long time, and it's always been something that we've been wanting to do probably for the last decade or so, is to do spatial prioritization across the land and sea for the coast. So it's really great to have that opportunity now to actually, to finally be able to do it.
Thank you so much, Linda. Maybe if I could just jump in where you've left. I'm a little bit curious. I mean, you mentioned that the partners in South Africa, these are institutions that you've worked with together, perhaps in different projects. And I would just like to maybe bring in Kira. As a German partner, how did you what was your experience working with different partners in a project like CoastWise? Because normally with one partner or two partners, perhaps you say it's easy to work with, but if you have more than three partners, so what has been your experience from the German side working with different partners on CoastWise projects?
Hi, thanks for the question, Paul. I'd say that it's been a great advantage to the project that we also have pre-established links to South Africa as a German partner, and we also know each other from previous work that we've done together. And we've also hugely benefited from the fact, like Linda has said, that the South African partners are a really, like we feel, a pretty tight community, really, and that you have that long history of working together and working towards, a shared goal, in a sense. So we've really benefited from that familiarity, from the trust, from the established connections, I would say, for CoastWise. So it's been a really good experience in a way because of that background. So we haven't actually had to start from scratch as such, and actually getting to know one another, as part of the first stages of the project, because we were able to build on an existing level of collaboration already.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's really great. Others will probably argue that the fact that you already know each other might also present some challenges. I mean, because in terms of timelines, in terms of budgets, allocations, would you like to perhaps follow up and ask, were there some maybe challenges that you also confronted at the beginning of the project initiation, or it was all smooth through the way?
I would be lying if I said it was all smooth throughout the way. But I would say, initially the project planning stage was, I would say, extremely constructive, because it felt like it was a very fortunate coming together of our interests, and each partner was able to bring a particular expertise, and it came together extremely well, I would say. The biggest challenge that we've had in the project, in fact, apart from COVID, has been that administrative timelines were difficult and also perhaps not so easy to foresee when we began our journey towards CoastWise. We had a lot of delay also in terms of sorting out timelines, sorting out budgets, and then sorting out contractual agreements as well, sort of partnership contracts and such like. So that was perhaps one of the biggest issues, we could say, but I wouldn't really say that it was an issue between the partners. It was just one of those things that just perhaps we didn't foresee quite, like that beforehand. If that answers your question.
Yes. The project was also, and that's a specialty of the MeerWissen initiative, a bit different in its inception, that there was a process of co-design before. Did you join something like this before? And maybe can you tell a bit how it affected actually the implementation of the project?
Also for me, as a slightly more veteran researcher, it has been a new experience to actually have a sort of dedicated co-design phase before we even started. I thought that was great. it's a really good opportunity, and it was wonderful because it all happened before COVID came. So we were able to actually really meet face to face, and we had time, and we could really sit together and benefit from each other's knowledge, meet each other as a whole team. And as Myriam said, there was also the other MeerWissen projects and their input. So that was a really constructive, really good way of designing the project at the end of the day. I mean, of course, you then have to go away and fine tune and actually do all the homework that then follows. But I think it was a really good way of making sure that it is a partnership that's based on equals, and it's not really, here's a German partner with all the money, there's the recipient who's, sort of receiving at the receiving end. So I think it's a very worthwhile thing to do.
That's very interesting, Kira. One of the things that I've noticed in your project, I think it's one of the projects that in the MeerWissen initiative that works directly with communities. And I'm just curious to find out, I mean, we had this Codesign at the partners level. And my question would be, perhaps, how were you able to translate this Codesign principle to a level that communities or the stakeholders on the ground were also able to feel part and parcel of the entire process?
Kira, you're probably best positioned to answer that, but I think we have had to rethink some of the ways that we were going to do our sampling and the ways that we were going to do our project up because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the way that we will take the human dimensions work forward will be at a much different scale to what we had initially intended. And I think there will be a little bit less engagement one-on-one with the communities just because of the constraints that we have in terms of being able to meet in person at the moment. So we've had to adapt our designs as the COVID has come along.
Thanks so much, Linda. So maybe for projects who are listening, who have also faced a similar challenge, and perhaps they could be asking themselves, we have a very tight timeline. Perhaps the budget is also constrained. Can you take us just briefly through some of the things you'll have had to change because of the COVID situation in terms of maybe activities? Of course, you mentioned that face-to-face interaction will be limited in one way or another. But in terms of project goals and project ideals, are these really significantly going to change, or these will still remain on course?
Okay, well, I was going to say, it has obviously had to change a fair bit, even though I would say that in all of the CoastWise working strands, if you like, we are able, we feel, to still deliver on the main milestones that we have set ourselves and the main outputs. As you were saying earlier, Linda, I mean, one big difference is that we're not going to be able to run the same degree of interactive workshops or interactive field studies that we had planned. So there's going to be more desktop, perhaps, study for some of our work, and also maybe more exchange with other projects that might be doing some similar work in order to compensate for that. But in terms of the overall output, we do hope that there's not going to be a significant change in what we can still achieve based on the work program that we have come up with. One other thing that has taken a hit, unfortunately, is the travel, and that's one thing that we do feel regretful about, because there's not going to be much opportunity now for partners, students, early career researchers to really meet one another. So we had planned, obviously, for travel between Germany, South Africa. There, we just don't know what the future holds, how that's going to be possible, if it's going to be possible to meet up. So that's one thing that we just have to live with, really, I would say. And just on the previous question, if I may, it is, I think, still a challenge for projects like CoastWise to really have a co-design phase beforehand, including stakeholders on the ground. We haven't done that simply because there is no resources really for that kind of thing, and also probably not enough time. So maybe for the future, it might be worthwhile to think of ways to make that first phase even more inclusive, even more integrative, which means taking longer during that phase to really bring people on board even earlier and to really make co-design co-design on the ground, if you like, because yes, we've had a good co-design phase, but that's mostly been, us researchers talking amongst ourselves in a way, maybe plus some people from authorities, ministries and so on, but not really any communities, at least in our case, on the ground, yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I guess that would be a gold standard of co-design, is including communities, local communities, as many stakeholders outside the actual research project from the start. But while we are at this local level, when I read about spatial planning efforts, biodiversity strategies, it's always like a national effort. Coming to this local communities, how is that like local needs and conditions reflected in those strategies or action plans or assessments? And is that maybe something that CoastWise is also addressing in your work, like scaling up from local communities to national efforts?
So as much as the spatial planning that we do is at a national scale, we do have some other work that is undertaken at a more local scale, and we are able to integrate that into the work that we're doing. So we can include data that's being collected at any scale into the national plan. The advantage is that a lot of our data is national, or are national, and so it's very easy for us to integrate them. So if we do have fine scale data that we collect at a local scale, then that's fantastic. That's really what we're aiming for.
Maybe we could just add a little bit of background on spatial plans in South Africa. I know you were asking a question earlier about marine spatial planning. So these are not national plans, but slightly smaller in scale. And there the idea, of course, is also to include as much localized information as possible. And the more fine-grained that information can be, the better, really, it is to integrate in different planning processes, not just marine, but also on the land side, for things like municipal planning or provincial planning as well.
Maybe just to shift gear a bit to Myriam, who has been a little bit quiet. I'm also a little bit curious in terms of capacity development. I think one of the priority areas of CoastWise is to build capacity among young researchers and emerging scientists. And to Myriam, I would like to ask you, as an emerging scientist or as a young scientist, what contribution do you see yourself making in the CoastWise project? And what are some of the skills or expertise that you foresee yourself developing? I mean, you're surrounded by a cloud of competent researchers. What are some of the take-away messages that you can also share with emerging researchers that such a project can bring to develop their career?
Yeah, I think what's standing out for me is the insights I get into what does it mean to be part of an international project and to work across institutions, and to see how a like co-design of a bigger project works, how a proposal needs to look like, how different ideas come together, because the CoastWise project has a quite broad scale. You get a bigger picture of what's possible, what's happening, and that like obviously broadens your horizon and your own work. And then, of course, working with different people, not only supervisors, but also working with people from overseas, like Kira, or people from the ministry, is an exceptional opportunity.
Maybe following up on that, how do you balance, might be quite interesting for the listeners, how do you balance cultural needs or values versus ecologic or economic values, especially in the local context?
Yeah, so that's a very good and valid question, and I think that's also one of the challenges of integrating ecosystem services in biodiversity planning. You need to make sure that in the end the interests are not conflicting. So in my case, I try to look out for services that are not a threat to biodiversity, for example. So if you want to protect ecosystem services along the coast, they should be also protectable. So that means if I'm focusing on food production, for example, that's not something that would be manageable. So I was looking for services that are nature-based, like recreation.
Just to follow on from what Myriam was saying, we have included the data that she's generated on coastal protection, on recreational outdoor activities, and on sports events. We have included that in the National Coastal Marine Spatial Biodiversity Plan. We have also included some preliminary data on areas that are important, like culturally significant areas. And this is one particular area of work that we will be expanding. And perhaps, Kira, you can maybe share with us some more of the work that we're planning to do on culturally significant areas.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, I mean, generally, when you look at any kind of spatial planning, marine spatial planning, there is a tendency to not really include culturally significant areas in such plans. So there's a bit of a data gap around the globe. It's not specifically, for South Africa or any other particular country. So what the CoastWise project is doing is to try and explore, first of all, different ways of understanding cultural relations to the coast. I mean, different people, different groups of people might have very different ideas as to why particular areas, coastal areas, are important for different types of practices. And it might be recreation, like Myriam was talking about, but it might also be a spiritual practice or a traditional practice, or maybe also something that happened in the past, that there's a long-standing connection of a particular community to a particular area or a particular practice related to the sea. So the idea really is to try and identify different ways in which those relationships can be captured, first of all, and then also to try and map those in a way that can then feed into the type of spatial planning that we were talking about already. So what we are trying to do is to identify, maybe from other projects, from other countries, from research, from ongoing projects, what has been done in that field. Is there anything perhaps that we could adopt? And then also to look at the specific South African situation and local examples of what those significant areas might be and who might consider something significant. Because before we can come to any trade-off discussions or integration considerations, we first of all need to know, what do we actually have? What are we actually dealing with? And only then can we start thinking about, well, okay, what might be perhaps more important in a particular area? Do we then prioritize economic development or the cultural relations, or maybe biodiversity, or maybe something completely different? So it's really to try and establish a baseline and to try and identify areas that are important for different cultural reasons, to different groups, to different people. Not sure if that makes it very clear, but
one nice relationship between those culturally significant areas and the biodiversity priority areas is that often where it's a culturally significant area and the intent is to keep that area in a natural or near natural ecological condition. And so if we can try and align areas where we need to keep natural for cultural reasons and also areas where we need to align for biodiversity reasons, then that's a win-win. And it also can potentially draw in some tourism opportunities. So for example, if we keep an archaeological site in a good condition, then it means that we can also potentially draw in tourism and potentially create some alternative or supplementary livelihoods for local communities as well.
I would like to jump in again and ask, in terms of communication, looking at everything that you're talking about, the issue of marine spatial planning, prioritization of biodiversity spots, and integration of cultural values as well, it is definitely challenging to pack all this in a way that local users can be able to understand, for example. So in terms of outputs and in terms of communicating to all the interested stakeholders, what is the vision of CoastWise in terms of presenting the results in a way that it can be appreciated by every stakeholder who has an interest in the resources that you're working with?
That's a really good question and a really important one. So CoastWise has tried to come up with a different range of communication approaches, I would say, for some of these results. And we tried to be a little bit innovative, depending on who the intended target group really is. And so one target group, for example, for us would be the policymakers and people perhaps in ministries, people engaging maybe in marine spatial planning. So for them, there needs to be, or information or results need to be packaged in a particular way that is relevant to them. So that might be a simple one-page policy brief, or maybe, a sort of very short communication document, something that's easy to understand and that has a key policy messages, perhaps, in a nutshell. But then there's also other target groups, and as you say, some of those might be local communities. And what we want to try and do is perhaps try some slightly more innovative methods like video briefs. So that would be perhaps, someone actually just talking about some of the results and explaining it a bit like we're doing now in the podcast, perhaps, trying to share why ecosystem services might be important, for example, or some of our other results, to make it relevant to people and try to communicate why some of this work is actually important, not just for some high-level policy, but for people on the ground, for communities, for local communities. So it really, we try to be target group specific a little bit in our outreach, in our communication.
Yeah, thank you very much, Myriam, Linda, and Kira, for this first glimpse into CoastWise that actually just started. So we're really keen on hearing more from you. Maybe as a take-home message to the listeners out there, maybe each of you, what is the vision you have for the impact that CoastWise can have on local communities or spatial prioritization landscape in South Africa in general?
So for a very long time, I have been quite passionate about what I call the coast crack. Because I'm a sandy beach ecologist as a speciality, I get very frustrated when there's planning for the ocean, there's planning for the land, and the beach, which actually very specifically requires that land-sea connection to be maintained intact. I get very frustrated with the separation in a lot of the processes that we're doing in both the biodiversity assessments and also in the spatial prioritization. And I think the same is true for other transitional systems, for example, the estuaries, and how the fresh water that flows from the estuary, well, from the rivers through the estuaries into the marine space, that's also a strongly connected system that is being treated in different compartments. And so I'm very excited about the fact that we're going to be doing this cross-realm planning for the first time. And it's really a dream of mine for, like I said, about the last decade. So it's so great to finally be in a position where we can start doing this work in an integrated way and not separating the coast into its different components, but to really look at it as an entity. And already some of the work that we're doing is starting to show the benefit of looking at the coast through that lens. And so I think the wins that we're going to get for coastal biodiversity are really, really great, and I'm really looking forward to it.
For me, obviously, with my ecosystem service lens, it's my vision is that we as humans, but also as South Africans, understand the interconnection between biodiversity and human well-being, and that it is essential to integrate that value into our biodiversity plans, because in the end, we want to make sure that not only us, but also future generations can still benefit from that massive value that biodiversity holds for us.
Yeah, and I suppose my passion has also for a long time been to look more closely at the cultural connections that we all have with the sea, with the coast, to try and identify more closely, really, how people relate to the sea, to the marine environment, and how that affects us all emotionally. So I'm with Myriam, really. The well-being connection is one that I'm really passionate about, and the different values that we attach to the sea, to the ocean, and to the coast. And I want to also, I'd love for CoastWise to perhaps make a small contribution to people's understanding that they do have a voice, and that they those values, those views of the sea, those relations that they have with the sea should be reflected in something like a marine spatial plan. And it would be fantastic if perhaps, through our work, we could make progress with methods that allow that integration to happen further. And also to make people more aware that, this is not something that should be ignored by policymakers, and that they should actually give their voice to those processes. And, that all those views are really important. And it's not just an abstract thing, planning, it's something that involves all of us and should be important to all of us. So, yeah, maybe we can make a small contribution to that as well.
And this marks the end of today's episode. Next time we'll take a journey to Mauritania on the Atlantic side of Africa, where the WASP project is facilitating the inclusion of biodiversity protection into the management of the fisheries sector as well as the oil and gas industry.